Hi there. It's Andrew Sweeney here. And before you listen to this fantastic lecture by Cadell Last, I'd like to do a little plug for the Maniphesto Media Academy. The MMA is a virtual classroom and men's group where we host lectures with people like Cadell, but also Jonathan Pajot, Alexander Bard, and many others. If you would like to join an alive learning community for men, please sign up and join us every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Central European Time. And check out the link below for more information.
Hi, welcome guys to the MMA. This evening, we've got my good friend Cadell Last joining us to give us a presentation on Jordan Peterson and indeed on some of the psychoanalytical aspects of his thinking. Cadell is he's a superstar of YouTube philosophy coming from Alberta, Canada. He was first of all a baseball player.
I've never been to Alberta.
Not Alberta then.
Alberta.
Well,
he's an Ontarian like me. We're from the same place.
Not Alberta. Okay.
He's from Hamilton, Ontario, which is the asshole of the world.
That's true. That's true.
I can attest to that.
Andrew is the asshole of MMA. Anyhow, he was a baseball player. He then got into philosophy. He describes his philosophy as philosophizing with a baseball bat. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no ladies here either. Gentlemen, I hand the floor to Cadell.
All right. Thanks for the intro. Yeah. Thank goodness I wasn't born in Alberta. It's horrible. Okay. So yeah, I'm just gonna do a quick presentation on Jordan Peterson and psychoanalysis. It was sort of at the request of Owen and the larger Maniphesto Media Academy. I know you guys have been discussing sort of the broader social context of Jordan Peterson and the rise of him to sort of cultural superstardom. So I just want to sort of give what I've tried to make as objective an overview of his thinking and situating that in relationship to psychoanalysis as I can give, or that I tried to give. And it was an extremely interesting exercise for me personally, because just like so many of probably everyone here, as soon as Jordan Peterson sort of rose to international superstardom, his thinking had a strong impact on me. And I spent many hours studying his lectures and reading his books. And in making this presentation, I had a chance to go back to some of those notes and go back to some of those presentations that fascinated me, 2016, 2017. And I developed a really interesting appreciation for him, having not sort of, focus specifically on his technical lectures for a few years. I had a gap and a space and some distance from him intellectually, and then revisiting him, really developed an appreciation for him as a subject and as a thinker, specifically in regards to how he really owned a specific historical problem of his moment in a very unique and personal way, and then sort of got caught up in international superstardom, after the fact, and that sort of brilliance was on display for everyone to see. But I really appreciated going back to some of his lectures and making this presentation. So I hope you guys will enjoy that as well. Let me go to full screen. All right, so Jordan Peterson and psychoanalysis. As everyone knows, Jordan Peterson studied with both Freud and Jung when he was a young student. No, but that just here's the joke of, this is an old picture of Freud and Jung actually at conference in 1909 in Clark University, where they were actually introducing psychoanalysis to the North American audience. Very famous conference. And of course, at a time when Freud and Jung were still working together amicably and professionally. But yeah, there's Jordan Peterson and the Lobster. So I want to start off with a quote from Hegel. This is from the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit. The quote is, quote, "In my view, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject," end quote. And the reason why I wanted to start off with this quote, not only does it capture so much of Hegel's philosophy, but it also captures sort of what I'm trying to do with this presentation. That is, I am trying to treat Jordan Peterson as a universal object, as a moment of the truth, a moment of the historical truth, as objectively as I can, as with as little bias as I can, and sort of with, I suppose, respect for his historical moment and the truth that it represents. I just wanted to give that, but that quote, then this is not a presentation about Hegel at all, but that quote really captures a lot, I think, of Hegel's philosophy, and that's from the preface of his Phenomenology of Spirit. So Jordan Peterson as a cultural phenomenon, he really started to explode in 2016, 2019. Of course, this is going to be a lot of review for most of you, I'm guessing. One of the interesting things about Jordan Peterson as a phenomenon, especially in our intellectual sphere, is that he was really one of the first university professors, one of the first people with a sort of a credible institutional background who took YouTube seriously as a medium of expression. And that really influenced me as well. I no longer saw YouTube as, okay, this popular medium where I have to keep my academic work separate from YouTube. I can use YouTube as an outlet. It's an outlet for academics. It's really a whole new institution. And in doing that, he started to appeal to a lot of, quote, stereotype was he was appealing to a lot of young men in between the ages of 15 and 30 who, for one reason or another, felt disenfranchised by the contemporary university institutions, or at least felt like those institutions weren't speaking to them directly, and found a huge market of guys who, and of course, it appealed to a lot of women as well, but this was sort of like the overall stereotype. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I don't think that truth delegitimizes him. Like whenever you hear people say, he appeals to young men, it's kind of used in sort of a way to sort of like delegitimize his thinking, like, oh, he appeals to young men, so that means he must be talking nonsense. I think that, and vice versa, he didn't appeal to a certain type of person, and that's another truth. And I think that, we have to be able to hold all of these contradictory truths if we're to sort of understand historical spirit. But in any case, he became a central figure in the culture wars. And that's sort of why we are talking about him. That's sort of why his thinking has become interesting, was because he became a polarizing figure. I often think about that in the context of Alexander Bard as well, is that we're not just thinking about people as, that they're just smart or that they're just geniuses, but they become polarizing historical figures. And then they become interesting to study. Like the sort of like the polarization makes their thought interesting. He became, this is sort of like the cliche at this point, but he became an enemy of postmodern Neo-Marxism. And I think to some degree we can question whether postmodern Neo-Marxism is a thing at all. But I think I do have an interesting perspective on the whole phenomenon of postmodern Neo-Marxism, because I actually did if there's anyone who had a perspective on it, I think it's kind of me, because I was doing my undergrad and my graduate school studies at McMaster University and University of Toronto, which was in Hamilton and Toronto, Ontario, which is the same region Jordan Peterson's from. And I can tell you that and I was working in anthropology departments, I was working in humanities departments. And there was a kind of vibe. I can only describe it as a vibe, or it's like there was something in the air, so, something in the social air, that whenever I was in a room, there was this feeling that I had that I was an enemy, like that and I felt, I didn't realize it at the time, but it did have something to do with the fact that I was a white man. It did have something to do with my identity, which I couldn't do anything about. So in that sense, Jordan Peterson was talking to something very real in the university system. At least I felt it. And that basically, what he means by postmodern neo-Marxism is basically a shifting of the political landscape from class consciousness, that's in Marxist terminology. When we're talking about Marx, we're talking about class consciousness and class conflict. And he's saying that class consciousness, that class conflict got shifted to identity consciousness and identity conflict. So instead of the bourgeoisie, proletariat, the upper class, the lower class structuring leftist political thinking, it all of a sudden became more focused on gender. It became more focused on sexuality. It became more focused on race. And class became less of a major polarizing sort of category of analysis for leftist politics. And this kind of pervaded the institutions. In any case, his professional background was a clinical psychologist. He had expertise in evolutionary biology, neuroscience, developmental science, and also had an existential lens. This was an interesting, but I would say conventional array of scientific topics. There's nothing controversial or nothing radical about being an evolutionary thinker, focusing on neuroscience or developmental thinking, or even being an existential philosopher. These are all pretty conventional forms of knowledge. However, what made Jordan Peterson so unconventional and what made him so peculiar as an institutional academic was that he was also playing around with psychoanalysis. He was also playing around with politics and religion. He would infiltrate, or he would sprinkle figures like Nietzsche and Jung and Piaget less so, but specifically Nietzsche and Jung. He would sprinkle them into his otherwise evolutionary background, and that did make him sort of unique, and that did make him strange in the context of academic philosophy and academic science, because Nietzsche and Jung are quite radical figures, and maybe in particular Jung is someone who's not taught very often in modern academics. But nonetheless, and psychoanalysis is sort of seen as often an outdated discipline, in line with this talk. Psychoanalysis is often seen, you oftentimes don't find many scientific people or cognitive scientific people who treat psychoanalysis with a, let's say, intellectual credibility. They sort of have this sort of default view that it's a bunk science, that it's outdated, that it's been surpassed. In any case, Peterson's deep motivation, and this is another thing that separates him from traditional, I think, or most professors in his position, is that it was so clear that he was deeply motivated. It was so clear that his passion and his motive for thinking was pervading his entire intellectual work. He wasn't just teaching university lectures, in other words. He wasn't just doing his job, so to speak. He had a mission. He had a deeply personal mission. And that brought with it a lot of authenticity. I think a lot of guys, especially young guys, resonated with that authenticity. They resonated with that passion. They resonated with the fact that he was motivated by something. And this is sort of the appreciation I was talking about at the beginning of my talk here. that I was sort of reflecting on more while making this presentation was that, he took a certain historical problem of his time, namely, what mostly fascinated him was the destruction of the Cold War, and nihilistic systems. Like basically, okay, we're in a secular age. We do not believe in, to use Nietzsche's language, we do not believe in God in the way that the pre-moderns believed in God. And in the void, or in the vacuum of those systems, we had ideologies. And those ideologies functioned like religious systems, and they wreaked enormous political havoc in the 20th century. And this is what Jordan Peterson was trying to think. This is the problem he was trying to think. All of the science, all of the philosophy, all of the references to Nietzsche and Jung, they're all sort of tarrying with this problem. And that sort of came across to a lot of people as something worth thinking about. So they deeply resonated with that, I feel. In any case, moving on. In Peterson's work, he is someone who grounds his knowledge in existential crisis. And this is something that I think is worth saying, that is something unique that psychoanalysis brings to knowledge, namely the discovery, I would say, that knowledge in itself is not useful. In other words, there is no intrinsic knowledge drive. Knowledge is only useful, or knowledge is only constituted by a drive insofar as it's speaking to an existential crisis. And this is at the ground of Peterson's thinking. And that's why he's interested in phenomenology. That's why he's interested in existentialism. He's not interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake. He's interested in the way in which knowledge inhabits a phenomenological or existential world. How knowledge is responding to or informing a certain existential condition, a certain problematic experience. Like I said, the existential condition and the problem that captured Peterson was the danger of ideological capture in civilized societies without understanding meaning. I sort of referenced this in the previous slide, but we can go a little bit deeper into what he's saying there is basically, there was a little bit of naivete on the part of Freud and Marx, according to Peterson, that we can just get rid of religion. We can sort of get rid of belief in God. We can propose that religion and belief in God are primitive ideological structures that are defenses against our own death anxiety. In other words, we can deconstruct these systems and we can construct a more rational, a more secular utopia. And of course, those failed. And Peterson was concerned about our inability in a secular scientific society to understand meaning in the way that the religious understood meaning. And the consequence being sort of that someone would act out a system of meaning like a National Socialist or like a communist. Of course, the National Socialist, I'm referring to the Nazi Party. I'm referring to, the basic ideological structures that caused World War II. But there can be other sort of systems of meaning that take on this power. Someone who is aligned to the United States. There are more trivial examples we can give as well, whether that's for sports teams, whether that's for music. It's basically, how do you fill the void of your existence? And Peterson was interested in that. and he didn't think that we had given it enough thought, and that in particular the secular scientific world was ill-equipped to think it. So he specifically refers to the Darwinian universe in this situation. He calls it a evolution-death reality, saying that what we are left with is an evolution-death reality. And this reality is basically saying that what the most real thing is not God, but whatever you can model that helps you to survive. And that when you're left with that understanding, or when you're left with that ideology, you can't help but confront the fact that whatever model it is that you can construct individually is, quote unquote, not very good. Namely that, you're only going to live for 80 years at most, 80, 90 years. That you are impotent, that you are powerless against much larger forces than you, and that it's hard to find a transcendental meaning in that system. In other words, there's a tendency to nihilism. This is what the tendency to nihilism is, according to Peterson. So where he sort of situates himself in regards to this existential crisis is that he says that we need to cultivate an art of modeling. In other words, we cannot just be sort of content with mimicking or, for lack of a better word, just copying scientific models that have been presented to us at university, and then think that we can go out into the world and everything's going to be okay, that we are going to be able to build families, engage in communities, feel fulfilled in a deeper sense in regards to our meaning of life, that we need to cultivate an art of modeling, and that this art of modeling, for Peterson, is a type of balance between a meaningful revelation, something very personal, and a truth stance. This is like a sort of a duality that he plays with. I just want to sort of emphasize this. I think it's interesting to think about. It's sort of like a revelation of meaning to you as an individual subject. Something meaningful happens to you. It can be very idiosyncratic. It can be spontaneous. It can happen in a very unexpected way. But that you as a subject need to take a truthful stance to this meaningful revelation. So like, if I was to give like a very personal example here, like I could take Owen asking me to give this presentation as a revelation of meaning, and then it's up to me as a subject to respond to that revelation in a truthful orientation. In other words, I show up to this presentation as truthfully as I can, as forcefully as I can, with all of my subjectivity here aligned to that revelation of meaning. And that sort of art of modeling, so I'm just sort of like reflecting on what I'm doing this moment, that art of modeling is, according to Peterson, a way to prevent being overwhelmed by the real. Again, the real here, and I think that this is, I think about this in a similar way, to be honest. The real here is like an evolutionary death reality, that most things will fail, that it's very likely that my model is stupid, and it's very likely that I'm just going to, like, I always give the example of, you're walking across the street and you get hit by a bus. Like it's very likely, like there's so many things that could take you out, so to speak. So, and that real can be overwhelming. And then on the other side, you can be corrupted by ideology. So you sort of have to balance being overwhelmed by being annihilated and being corrupted by a too perfect or a too static belief system. In other words, like, say, for example, Owen asked me to do this presentation, and, I was just coming here with sort of a pre-packaged ideological position that I hadn't really done the work of showing up to this moment. To give an example, like of again reflecting on like how you can be corrupted by your own ideology. So moving on from this, he develops an entire system that he calls the maps of meaning. This is influenced by Jung. This is also influenced by two other great thinkers, Mircea Eliade and Joseph Campbell. I'm never sure if I pronounce Eliade's name correctly, but I strongly recommend checking out their work. What unifies all of these three thinkers, and this is against postmodernism for Peterson, is that all three thinkers have this idea that there's a central narrative. In other words, it's not something that can be deconstructed. It's not a narrative that you can just sort of analyze, pick apart, and sort of relativize. It's a central narrative that's built into our need for value, and that's consequently built into our very nature as embodied beings. In other words, it's not optional. It's something that if you are going to live a thriving, let's say, if you're going to thrive in this existence as a human, this is not optional. According to Peterson, this is something that we do naturally, and following Jung, Eliade, and Campbell. Now, in any case, Peterson operates in a narrativistic reality, which he calls hyper-real. And he juxtaposes this, and he compares this or differentiates himself from typical understandings of the scientific real or scientific reality, which with a narrativistic reality. And he refers to the human being as a being that's universally obsessed with things like music and art and poetry and literature, that we are creatures of music, we are creatures of art, we are creatures of poetry, and literature, and so on, and we engage in these activities in the same way that a spider spins its web, so to speak. It's that natural, it's that ingrained into us. What's sticking out to me right now is simply, I remember reading an evolutionary biology text where they were talking about how if you take out a spider's webbing from its internal system, it will still try to spin a web even though it can't. So it's that deeply ingrained in its programming. It has to spin a web, even if it can't spin a web. So I imagine like music and art and poetry and literature are just that fundamental for us. So he says that a classic story guides a profound character transformation. This is the universal story. And it's structured basically by a chaotic or destructive event being overcome for a better reality, that we, in some sense, in order to become our highest selves, or in order to have a thriving existence, we need to, in some sense, go out into the unknown. We need to go out into some chaotic, destructive landscape where our identities are threatened. And we need to overcome this chaos. We need to overcome this for a better reality. So, I mean, I have some interesting examples about this, but the first thing that comes out is the Buddha story, to be honest with you, because the Buddha was someone who was insulated and protected from chaos and destruction. And in order to become the Buddha, he, in some sense, had to confront chaos and confront destruction in order to become what he was. So that's a good example of this classic story, let's say. The Buddha story is a great classic example. I'm sure there's many others, and I'm not an expert in mythology, so I would point to Jung and Campbell to learn more about these. For example, A Hero with a Thousand Masks. That's a great book to read if you want to learn more about mythology in this direction. In any case, the narrative is more true than the people's individuals' beliefs. In other words, whether or not you believe this, it doesn't matter. This is sort of, again, some deeper hyper reality. And that the reason why it's true is because, and it goes back to Peterson's grounding in existentialism, that pain is a real category. The way Peterson talks about it and the way Peterson frames his system, it's kind of like pain is the ultimate reality, and your capacity to engage with and confront pain with bravery is what brings this narrative out. And again, the Buddha story is coming to mind as something that fits really nicely with the way he's thinking here. Basically here you have a story from A to B, where again, it's the hero with a thousand faces, where the hero of myth traverses order and chaos for a better world. And this is something that's really key for Peterson, and maybe key on a meta level for why people are attracted to Peterson. But that others you admire are sort of a clue to this truth. In other words, like who you admire in your pantheon of idols are a clue to this sort of character in yourself. They're pointing or guiding or attractive figures that sort of reveal an aspect of yourself which you could become in your own way if you were willing to be real with pain. If you were capable of confronting the chaos and coming out on the other side, transformed, transfigured by that process. And basically what that process is about is potential. And it's about sort of seeing the reality of that potential. In other words, training yourself not to look at what reality, like, okay, so we have five senses. And when we perceive the world, we're perceiving what's actually there through our senses. What we can't see with our senses is the potential. And this is sort of training people, training anyone to, instead of seeing what's just in front of you, to also see that overlapped with a potential that's there. That, like, what I've been saying a lot lately is like that your present moment is pregnant with potential. I like that metaphor. That you are constantly giving birth. It's not just a stillborn present. And that is sort of what's most meaningful to us, that being in touch with that potential is what's most meaningful to us. And it gives our lives a meaning. And of course, for Peterson, it's a flaw in scientific metaphysics to think that what's most real is the external physical object. So again, what I was saying about the five senses, sort of being lowered to the five senses and what they can perceive as external physical objective, to say that's the most real is to do a disservice to our capacity to see what can't be seen, simply. And that brings us to the internal world. It brings us to the world of the living subject. And the mystery of consciousness. And that sort of captivates all of Peterson's thinking, right? It's sort of this transition of thinking from the external physical object to the internal living subject, and really taking seriously the mystery of consciousness, with this relationship between the potential and the actual. I like the way he does it. In any case, I want to emphasize again this sort of dualism that he plays with of a meaningful revelation and a truth stance to that meaningful revelation, because Peterson sort of situates love as key to this process. I gave the example of, okay, Owen, if I treat Owen's request to do this presentation as a revelation of meaning, and then I take a truth stance to that, in order for me not to be corrupted, or in order for me not to be obliterated by the real, being overwhelmed by the real, I think Peterson would say that that entire process has to be sort of brought together or centered with love. And that allows you to bring forth your potential. So like right now, what I'm doing right now, I couldn't perceive when Owen asked me to do the presentation. It's a potential which has been brought forth. And I'm just giving this example because it's very, it's self-referential. And I think you can use what I'm saying in whatever field you're engaged in, whether you're a musician, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a poet, whatever it is you're doing, I think that this sort of process can be useful to think about. In any case, so Peterson has a very developmental view on on consciousness, and he situates it always within a dialectic of the child and the adult, where the child is just a pure potential and the adult is an actuality, and that the adult can gain something from turning its potential into something actual. They can become potentially a good partner, a good parent, a good citizen. But, and here Peterson is showing his capacity to be a good dialectical thinker, because he says that the risk is that in turning your potential into something actual is that you lose something. You are narrowing yourself. You are losing a certain openness. And then on the opposite side, if you just remain a child and you do not grow up, so to speak, and become actual, you become Peter Pan. Peterson gives the example of Peter Pan. You remain just this potential which has no actuality to it. In any case, if you do take on the burden of meaning and the burden of responsibility, and you develop yourself into an adult, once you have gained an actual existence, so for example, for myself, I've become a philosopher, then you can reopen, you can become more childlike, you can become more playful after you've built up an actual structure. So there's a whole dialectical process here in his thinking about consciousness, which I would simply, relate back to how I opened this presentation with a quote from Hegel, because that's basically how Hegel tries to understand consciousness, is through a dialectical process. I can go deeper into this because basically, if we think about Peterson's maps of meaning, what he's saying when the adult has reached a higher level of actuality is that then the adult can become aware, and awareness is the crucial category. The subject can become aware of what he calls a hole in the map. And that hole in the map, in other words, where your map is wrong, where your map is incorrect. So if you don't become too rigid and ideological with your map, you can pay attention to the hole in your map, and that's where new meaning can come. So how I can relate to this in my own work is that I've been working on a philosophy of lack. So I would relate my philosophy of lack series as pointing to this hole in the map where meaning can come forth if you are aware, if you're paying attention to the present moment. Now let's get into psychoanalysis. So Peterson refers to both Freud and Jung with great admiration and great respect. And I consequently appreciate him for the way he carries himself when he talks about the founding fathers of psychoanalysis. He's always sort of adamant to claim that psychology has been unfair to Freud, and our contemporary culture has been totally unfair to Freud. Basically, what our contemporary culture has done, and my main thing is, if you haven't read Freud directly yourself, try not to get ideologically possessed with what the culture has said about Freud, because most people who are talking about Freud are ideological to an extreme. They haven't read him. In any case, what Freud has got right has already largely been integrated into our culture. That's how genius he was. I don't think there has been a more influential thinker in the 20th century in terms of how much of what he did became integrated into our culture. It is that fundamental. I'd put him on the same level as Einstein in physics. And another interesting thing about Freud is that even when Freud was wrong, he was wrong in an interesting way. You can learn something in how he was wrong. He wasn't just wrong in a misleading way. In any case, what Freud discovered was the unconscious psyche. So in other words, before Freud, the philosophical and psychological understanding of the psyche was that the psyche was everything in your conscious awareness was your psyche. Freud was saying that actually most of your psyche is unconscious. In other words, you're not conscious of most of what you are. And that there was enormous rational resistance to this idea. And still to this day, there is an enormous rational resistance to the idea that most of what you are is unconscious. And specifically, what it is that's unconscious are uncontrollable primal forces. This is oftentimes resisted because the rational mind finds this embarrassing. The rational mind finds this humiliating. The fact, like I can give a concrete example. So my rational psyche was successful in moving through academia and completing a PhD thesis. But in terms of my unconscious, I was being totally controlled and undermined by my own sexual passions and my own sort of libidinal impulses. While I was completing my PhD, my entire personal life was a mess because I had not paid enough attention to my own libidinal impulses. So the unconscious psyche is oftentimes very simple, but very powerful. And oftentimes it's where your life force is. To give a Peter, it's where your life force is, man. It's like where you are. In any case, one of Freud's most important ideas is the Oedipus complex. It's also one of his most controversial ideas. He claims that the Oedipus complex is more useful than has been recognized, and at its most simple is that the child is trapped in familial identity and it cannot become independent because it is in some sense controlled from within by images of the father and images of the mother. In other words, its earliest, most intimate relational impressions are trapping it from becoming independent. Because when you were a child, when you were an infant, you were totally dependent on your parents. Or if you're not raised by your parents, if you were totally dependent on older figures. And all of the forms of consciousness that were scared or terrified or annoyed or frustrated when you were 1 and 2 years old, all of those psychic structures are still within you. They're still there. And that's what the rational psyche has trouble sort of grasping with, that actually, so you're looking at me now, I'm a 34-year-old man. But if you're looking at me in the way that Freud would look at me, I have layers of my psyche. I'm still an infant. I'm still a child. I'm still a teenager. Those layers of the psyche are still in me. And if my higher order psyche breaks down, I'll revert to those psychic impulses. I've done it myself. If I'm frustrated or if I'm really disturbed, I'll curl up in a ball like an infant, and I'll just want to put the blankets over me and be in the dark. I just want to go back to the womb. These structures are still inside of us. They're very powerful, very intimate. Another interesting idea that Freud had was that sexuality is not something that we can abstract away from our psyche, that the psyche is in some sense a response to and mediated by sexual energy, libidinal energy. This is the libido, the notion of the libido. Consequently, for Freud, and Peterson is very clear about this, is that he thinks the modern secular culture is incredibly naive about sexuality, that they don't realize, when we think about modern permissive sexual culture, just going on dating apps or messing around with many people, Peterson is obviously totally against this, and basically is saying that sexuality is both incredibly dangerous and incredibly important for emotional and social health. That doesn't say what you should do with it. It's not a moral repression. It's more a sort of a recognizing that you have to take it seriously in some sense if you care about your whole thriving. Again, that it doesn't mean that you have to be a certain way. It just means that you have to think about how my libidinal energy is integrated into my whole psychic personality. And that repression occurs, the mechanism of repression in Freud, it occurs because of the impossibility of a full psychic integration. It's never possible to fully integrate sexuality into your conscious psyche. It's something that you constantly are wrestling with. It's something you're constantly negotiating with, living with as an ongoing construction. And this brings us back to the art of modeling. The art of modeling. I think this is so crucial for the art of modeling. In any case, Freud's psyche is divided up into three forms between the id, the ego, and the superego, and that developmental problems occur when the ego is wrestling with one or the other sort of extreme of the psyche, that being the id or the superego. I often think about the ego as kind of being like between a rock and a hard place. Like it can't win. It's like on the one end, you've got these ridiculous primal impulses that are very disturbing and very powerful at the same time. And then you have the superego, which is kind of like this ideal of social performance, which is kind of like not sexual and like kind of very normalizing and kind of always in relationship to what others think. And the ego is kind of like between these two in extremes. In any case, Peterson was also a big fan of Jung, a huge fan of Jung and an admirer of Jung. And Jung sort of had a different perspective on the mind, or at least the challenge of psychoanalysis. And I'm not going to get in the differences between Freud and Jung here. I'm just going to get into more sort of trying to communicate how Peterson views the Jungian project, let's say. So Jung had the aim of making conscious the primordial imagination. And the primordial imagination for Jung was a collective imagination that we all shared. In other words, so if I was giving the example of Freud as bringing me back to an image of myself as a baby, Jung was trying to bring the mind back to the original imagination of humanity, to give that example. And he was doing this because he took the challenge of Nietzsche seriously, namely that we killed God, so we killed our highest ideal. So we are going to have to confront that we have to become what we killed. This was sort of like how Jung was wrestling with Nietzsche and Nietzsche's sort of hysterical challenge to humanity in the aftermath of a secular post-religious society, here to bring us full circle as well to, what I was emphasizing was motivating Peterson. In any case, for the psychoanalyst, a theologian will put God as the highest ideal. A fascist will put the state as the highest ideal. A nihilist will put nothing as the highest ideal. And a communist will put the historical process as the highest ideal. But the psychoanalyst, will be skeptical of all the ego's reasons. And we already covered why the psychoanalyst would be skeptical of all the ego's reasons, because the psychoanalyst knows that most of what you are is unconscious. So the psychoanalyst knows that you're split within. So whatever you're saying rationally might not actually be where your real ideal is. So where Jung thought we should go to look for our true ideals is by studying the substructures of historical thought, the collective unconscious, and trying to see what archetypes in the collective unconscious are ingrained in our very being. This back to the central narrative idea. What is ingrained in us so deeply that it can't be deconstructed, or it can't be sort of historicized away as something that we can just get rid of. Now, for Jung, he would say, don't listen to what a rational ego says about what their highest ideal is. Watch what their attention is regulating. What are they regulated by in terms of their attention? What are they paying attention to? The more ideal, the more attention they'll give. So in other words, what people are paying attention to is what they really value. So if, like, for example, say, for example, some of you right now aren't actually watching my presentation, but you're watching some sort of, you could be watching a girl's image. Maybe you're watching a porn flick in the corner of the computer screen instead of watching me. Well, if you are doing that, that will show you where your real value is. That will show you that you care more about the image of the woman's body than you do about an intellectual presentation. And if you are doing that, I don't care at all. But it's just that it just gives you an example of how a subject is split in terms of where its real attention is. And for Jung, the guru or the savior figure was basically an amalgamation of the most ideal forms of man. And that would be what humans built religion out of. So, for example, a Jesus figure or a Buddhist figure would be a collection of archetypes. So it's, and we know this from history, that, the Jesus figure was a story, or the Buddha figure was a story that was repeated thousands of times. So it's not like they were one figure. It was that they're an amalgamation of ideals that humans paid a lot of attention to and built metaphysical structures with. And the final point about Jung here is that he claims that modern man worships poorly, and I agree with him there. He says that modern man is shallow and superficial with the way he worships, and that he fails to integrate the unconscious ideals into secular culture. So I think that brings us full circle here with why Peterson was interested in Jung and why he thought it was important to pay attention to Jung in regards to the problem that spoke to Peterson, namely that he felt like there was a huge challenge with filling the void in our secular culture. So here to summarize, this is the final, I'll just say this is just a summary of what I've told you, that Peterson was embedding his knowledge in the existential crisis He was trying to find a way to avoid death and ideology at the same time. He was coming up with the maps of meaning to do that, that we had to confront a destructive chaos in order to bring forth the best of ourselves, and that is a universal process for an individual. He wanted to pull our attention towards the potential of the present moment, and that helps to adultify ourselves, that each of us has a strong adult structure which we can cultivate, and then become even more aware once we've done that. And then finally, Peterson found a lot of truth in both Freud and Jung, and the whole psychoanalytic movement, specifically because the unconscious psyche was a site of constant sexual and familial struggle, and that we have to think this. And then on the other hand, the unconscious is where we can find our true ideals. And that we can be more true to ourselves if we are aware of what we are really idealizing, and potentially mature our idealization. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't go too much over time, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, Cadell.
Thank you, Cadell. Can I begin with a question? Is that all right with everybody? So I'm interested in adultification from the Freudian and the Jungian point of view. And I think maybe I have this wrong about Freud. And this is a stereotype. And you probably, because I've read deeply Jung and I haven't read deeply Freud. I have read some Freud. That Freud was about curing, let's say, the Peter Pan complex. And that Jung was more about integrating it. So I might be wrong about that, but what I find interesting is that the Peter Pan complex, or the golden, the eternal boy complex, and the Senex, or the old man complex, is that there's a negative version of that, and there's also a positive version of that. So the old man who keeps his eternal energy, his kairos, his ability to be in the present moment, as opposed to the when he's an old man, is the one who's really integrated the archetype, because the archetype has two faces. It has the old man and the child are one from a Jungian perspective, not separate. So it's not a linear developmental model. Anyway, are you following my question?
Well, I would say Freud never talked about anything like a Peter Pan complex. What Freud was interested in was helping people with what he called neuroses. And neuroses were things that you might say keep people childlike, because the neuroses are basically internal psychological structures which demand that the subject withdraw its libidinal energies from the world and keep them for themselves instead of using them in the world. In other words, instead of maturing those, instead of working with your sexual energy and confronting the challenges of the world, neurotic people will often recoil from the world and withdraw into themselves.
Which is the mother complex, right? Because it's regressive, right? You're going to want to go back. I mean, well, I think both of them describe that as the mother complex.
Well, the neuroses can have a dimension that's maternal and a dimension that's paternal.
Right. But I would say
that it's related to the Oedipus complex.
Okay.
Which has a maternal dimension and a paternal dimension.
Yeah. So the maternal would be the devouring mother, and Jordan Peterson uses these words, and the paternal neurosis is the tyrannical father, which is like becomes the senile old man because he's lost his connection to that nowness, that youthful energy.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Anyway. Wonderful presentation, by the way. I think you're embodying what Peterson talks about, and this is this fire, this passion, and truthfulness, dedication to being as truthful as possible.
Yeah, because otherwise your knowledge is just dead.
Yeah.
If it's not connected, if your knowledge isn't connected to like the real of what's actually happening in your life,
Yes,
then what the hell is your knowledge for?
and I've noticed that about you and other presentations, that you always bring in your personal experience to whatever we're talking about, so that it doesn't become just a mere abstract thing. And I think that's what Peterson, that's why he made so many academics jealous, because he was on a real quest, a real mission, and Absolutely. They were up in abstract land of language, and so they were viciously attacking him because they couldn't come down from their ivory tower.
That's exactly right. And that's such a big challenge for academics and intellectuals. And it's such a risk. It is becoming disconnected from your personal existence and basically living a split life. Whatever it is your intellectual life is on the one hand, and your personal life on the other hand, and they never meet.
Yes.
So basically what I try to do in everything I do is whatever I'm thinking about intellectually, I'm trying to sort of loop it in to what's happening in my personal life directly. And that sort of keeps me grounded, while also I'm not against intellectual work, of course.
Cool. Maybe Owen has a question, and then we can go have
I'm thinking since we've gone over a bit, I think I want to throw it straight to the floor. So I think, Daniel, you've got your hand raised. Do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks, Cadell, for a brilliant presentation. I always enjoy listening to you. I guess my question is a bit more general, and it touches upon Peterson, but it's more general than that. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the relationship between subjectivity and relativism. Like how do we involve the subject as a channel for real truth, and all at the same time avoid relativism? That's my question.
Well, so the context. Well, I think there's a great philosophy presentation by Richard Roderick. I recommend his lectures in general, but he's a great continental philosopher, and he was talking about Derrida and deconstruction, and he was saying it's actually a myth that any philosopher ever believed in pure relativism. There isn't a philosopher you can find that say, this is just a pure relativist, meaning that every truth is the same as every other truth, and every system of knowledge is the same as every other system of knowledge. The question is, how do we include the subject and remain sort of true or in a sort of dialectical relationship with objectivity? And the way Peterson does it is in relationship to pain. In other words, he's keeping himself oriented and organized in his thinking in relationship to the fact that no subject will deny the reality of their pain when they're in pain. Like if you just had your finger cut off, or if you just had your leg cut off, it's like that's the only thing that you're paying attention to. Like that's the only thing that matters. And if you're like, it's kind of like when Sweeney was talking about the disembodied academic who just becomes lost in intellectual work. It's kind of made possible by the pleasure principle. In other words, they become so encased in a pleasure bubble, and things are so sort of easy for them that their knowledge can become disconnected from the real. So, in other words, how do we keep our knowledge objective while including the subject? I would say that you keep your knowledge in constant relationship with existential difficulty. if you keep your knowledge in a loop with existential difficulty, and I think most existentialists and phenomenologists would agree with that, is that if you keep your knowledge in a constant loop with existential struggle, basically the relationship between pleasure and pain, then you are going to increase the probability of remaining objective, but the objectivity that you're working with is kind of a meaningful objectivity because it's something that's within the constraints of pleasure and pain. Right. It's not like, so like, for example, it's not an objectivity of a Newtonian science. Like in a Newtonian science, you're sort of interested in what's objective, independent of your subjective experience. Now, I think that there's a use value to that historically. I mean, the entire engineering departments and entire physics departments are set up on this form of objectivity, and I'm not against it. But it's the question of whether that way of knowing is relevant to the real of historical subjectivity, and I don't think it is. I would say if we are interested in the real of historical subjectivity, we have to bring it within the constraints of what historical subjectivity finds meaningful and objective for its life. Right. And I can tell you that how Freud did it was he instituted the pleasure principle. He said that consciousness was regulated by the pleasure principle, and then he sort of followed that trail as far as it would lead him, and it led him to death, the death drive.
So just to follow up on that real quick, so can we say that the I don't know if this is the right English word, but intersubjectivity, is that like the thing that most subject can experience, like pleasure and pain, for example. They can be objective in a phenomenological sense that everybody can experience them. And so can we use those universal subjective experiences as sort of, what would you call it? Can't find the word. Could we use those experiences as guidelines to objective truth?
I think I've missed what's the exact question? I think I've missed. Like, can we?
Yeah, I mean, just.
I just want to make sure I get it precise.
Right. I mean, so we are all subjects. We human beings are all subjects, right? Yep. And there are certain experiences that are universal for us. For example, everybody can experience pain, and everybody can experience pleasure, and so those experiences are objective in that sense that they are subjective experiences, but they're still they're subjective experiences, but they're objective in the sense that every subject can experience them.
Yeah, they're objective for the subject.
Exactly. And so so let me make it simple. Is what is objective for the subject? Is that the only interesting question when it comes to objective truth?
If you're interested in grounding your knowledge within the historicity of subjectivity, then that would be the starting point, I think.
Right.
But I mean, if you're interested in I could philosophically problematize it. Like, so for example, I could say, there's many, for example, like I could give the school of object-oriented ontology and philosophy who are interested in what the moon is independent of any subject. Like, and there are many physicists, right? Like, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with this, but like physicists would be interested to know, like, what are the conditions of the Big Bang independent of any subject that ever exists or they never existed. We want to know what it is. And then the philosopher could say, another philosopher could say, well, how can you get out of your own loop of self-positing that?
Yes.
Right. So this is very interesting. These are very interesting philosophical questions about the relationship between subjectivity and objectivity, the categories that Hegel uses in his dialectic. So exactly how you're describing it, the categories that Hegel uses are the in itself and the for us.
Yep.
So in itself, objectivity, and for us. What the in itself is for us.
Right.
I want to cut you guys off here because Esko was really adamant that we should have breakout rooms so that everybody can have a chance to talk a little bit here. But I would also, I hope that Cadell will come later. I've gotten drunk with Cadell, and he's a very serious philosopher, but he's also a funny guy when to drink with. So I hope that part of the event will add something to the Cadell Last experience, and I hope we can do breakout rooms now. Cadell, do you have a question or something you could ask people to ponder in a breakout room?
I discussed this a little bit with Owen. We sort of came down on the idea that it would be interesting if people discussed the relationship between psychoanalysis and psychology, because one of the interesting things about Jordan Peterson is that he is a clinical psychologist. He is someone who knows a lot about neuroscience and developmental science and evolutionary science, but he also takes, like, for example, Jungian metaphysics very seriously. So what is the difference between a clinical psychological education and a psychoanalytic education? And why is it that Jordan Peterson in particular became so popular in some sense? Because he was able to relate to both worlds, let's say.